Welcome to the course Qualitative Methods for Business and Management. In this brief video lecture, we will talk about case study procedures. This is an overview of the different stages, the common stages in doing a case study. Planning refers to identifying what the research question for the case studies or case study is and what the other rationale is. So is it for description, exploration, or explanation? Designing means that we have to choose the type and kind of case study that we're engaging. Is it single versus multiple? Is it embedded or holistic? What is our unit of analysis? If it's a multiple case of study, what is our replication logic and how many cases are we selecting? Is our case study deductive or inductive? The next typical step is then preparation, which involves taking the necessary steps to conduct quality data collection. This is the stage where we engage in crafting protocols, procedural protocols, get ethical consent, sign contracts with case study partners, and so forth. Collecting means executing the protocols and gathering data from multiple sources. Analyzing means examining and categorizing and coding or tabulating, testing, or otherwise studying the evidence that we collected during the collection to draw certain empirically based inferences and conclusions. And finally, sharing means that we take the case study results and put them into a format, a reporting format that we can use to document and report our case study procedures and findings. This could be in textual format, and it could be in graphical format or any other media, say through in audio format or anything else. What you can see in the schema on the right-hand side is that, as is common in qualitative research, this is not necessarily a linear sequence where we go from 1 to 6 and then we're done. Rather, you will see that very often we go to and from and we make changes. So, for example, after planning and designing, which is always the start, of course, we go to preparation, collection. What happens very often is that after collecting some data, you analyze that data, and then you make choices to collect some more data. So you go back to step 4 if you want, or you can even go back to step 2 and think that you might want to sample more additional cases, right? So you then have to decide on a replication logic, snowball sampling, theoretical or literal, which means we probably have to do some more preparation, start doing more collection, go back to analysis, maybe even go back to collection. And at some stage, of course, we always end up in sharing. So it's a nonlinear emergent research design modeled even in case study procedures. To illustrate this with an example, you may remember the example of positive deviance, of studying high performers that are doing something different from the average and low performers. And because they're doing something different, they produce a higher performance. Yeah, so a deviant that is positive. Here I brought some examples for how we executed our study of positive deviance in this particular case in retail bakeries, so in bakery stores that we see in a traditional grocery supermarket. Here's an example of a protocol that we developed in drafts. So we had protocols for observational parts. So, for example, we took note which process we wanted to observe, which document we wanted to analyze. We also drafted interview protocols where we planned about which roles in the organization we wanted to talk to, which questions we wanted to ask, and so forth. And you can see here, this was a planning protocol that we developed together with Woolworth, which is a retail company. That was our case study partner. In designing, we needed to select cases, and in this particular example, we selected multiple cases, so it was a multiple case design, and we had a theoretical sampling logic. We had particular theoretical expectations based on this theory of positive deviance, meaning that from all the stores that sold more or less bakery goods, depending on customer penetration, yeah, and here you would see the average of all of this, we try to identify who is performing significantly better than the rest under equal circumstances, which means we sampled selections that were positively deviant, which are those two that sell more given their level of customer penetration. And of course, we sampled some that were average, and we also sampled some that were negative deviants, if you want to call them that were relatively speaking lower performing than 95% of all bakeries, which were the ones below the lower blue line here in this graph. Yeah, and here would be an example, and actually you can see some of the example store here. We had Sydney Central Business District, Metropolitan Centra, we had Cairns, Town Hall, Manly West, and a few other places. What you see here also is that these are different types of bakeries. We had a particular timing plan, and so we developed a particular selection and visit strategy for when we could go and observe the bakers in these particular bakeries. Collecting then it means, as is common in case studies, means interviewing, document study, and observation in our case, which means we had interviews that we conducted with all personnel, such as bakers, baker's assistant, department managers, and so forth. Observation means that we observed them while they were doing their work, which in this case means baking, dressing, selling, and so forth. And document analysis in this particular case meant literally studying the recipes. And of course, any other policy documents, for example, health and safety regulations that pertain to an in-store bakery. So this is how we do planning, designing, and collecting. The next step then is analyzing case study data. In a very broad sense, you can here distinguish three different activities in data analysis. The first one is called data reduction, meaning that we need to reduce this large, unstructured, multiple source of evidence piece of data that we have into what are the key insights. Yeah, so if you think in our example, we visited 17 bakeries, we talked to roughly 50 people, we had hours of documentation, thousands of photos, hundreds of pages of documents, and you need to reduce this to some key findings in a way that becomes accessible. Second, we need to display this data. Now, the difference between quantitative and qualitative research is, of course, that we have anything but numbers. Numbers can be displayed in meaningful statistics, think means, think medians, standard deviations, significant levels, p-values, and whatever. They're very, very numerical. But in qualitative research, the issue is that we're dealing with words, displays, imagery, audio content, and so forth. So this richness of the data has to be made displayable in a varied but also accessible form. And finally, of course, we need to worry about drawing conclusions. So developing plausible and verifiable conclusion based on all this rich but also unstructured data. These are the three steps that are involved in case study data analysis. And as you can see, again, they're very being intertwined, not in a linear sequence. So you really move back and forth between displaying some data, reducing the data, drawing conclusions, displaying some more data to back up those conclusions, and so forth. In case study, we use a number of different techniques, but some of the most common ones include a technique that's called coding, which is a technique that allows you to organize raw data into conceptual categories, where each code is like a label or a tag or a bin, if you want, to where you place a piece of data. So something that someone said, you would label under a particular code or a tag, and later you would say, look, this person is very emotional. Yeah, emotional outburst could be a code for a very lengthy rant by a manager who complained a lot. A second key technique is what's called memoing. Memoing is a subjective commentary or reflection piece where you take notes of what was happening at the time of place of data collection. This is very important because of the richness that you have in case study research. Imagine putting yourself, you wake up at 2 a.m., you go to a bakery, 10 people burst into the room, they start baking multiple products. By 6 a.m., you have literally 300 bread rolls produced. There's a lot of hustle and bustle going on, a lot of richness, and you're in the middle of it trying to take note of all of this. This can be very overwhelming, so it's very important to write down quick pieces of reflections shortly afterwards as learning, so you do remember later what was happening at the time, because otherwise you will forget. Here are two examples of this. This is what's called coding, where you take the verbatim statement of what people said, say in an interview setting, and you, for example, highlight so-called in vitro codes, which are codes that are words and terms that the respondents use themselves, like values, health, close-knit, change. And then you could also relate them to themes, ideas, which is a form of memoing if you want. This is a memo that we use to produce after data collection. This, for example, is from a study where we studied senior directors at Commonwealth Bank, a large bank, and we noted down observations that we had from talking to the chief information officer at that time. What we do in case study analysis is basically we repeat these processes of display, reduction, and conclusion drawing until we reach a point where we know that we're finished. This point is called theoretical saturation. That's a term used to describe the situation that from our data analysis, we generate no additional insights, concepts, or ideas. This then signals the point for us to stop collecting and analyzing more data because we learn nothing new from the case. We are saturated. All the insights that we could have generated, we have generated. And a way to look at this is if people keep on saying things that you've heard over and over before. Again, here's an example. This is from a study where we did multiple interviews, in this particular case with 15 people. And what we did is we tracked how many new codes, how many different types of labels and tags that we associate with what people actually said that we generate from each interview. You see, in the first interview, we generated 33 codes, the second 36, the third one 12, the fourth one 33. So we're already at over 100 codes, insights and ideas that emerge from data analysis. That's very common that in the beginning you generate lots of new insights because everything is new when you talk to people. What you also see is that at some stage, this number of additionally new insights that I haven't yet captured is actually starting to decline. And at some stage, it literally reaches zero. Yeah. And so in our case, after 13 interviews, we didn't learn anything new. We did 2 more and realized we're learning nothing new here. We seem to be saturated. And that meant we knew we could finish our interviews. There was no point in asking even more people. The final stage of case study procedures is the sharing or reporting of a case study. Here, so making the findings accessible to others. Here, what is important is that there are some differences between who is the audience of your case study report. Are you writing a case study report for academia, as a paper or a book? Are you writing a thesis for your academic advisor? Or are you writing a report for your case study partner? Very often, the organization that you're doing your case study with wants to learn what you have found in your case study. And they want basically a report. So here, a key takeaway is that you want to match the format to the audience. For example, most organizations do not want to have a 50-page PDF document. They very often prefer a report in the form of a workshop or PowerPoint presentation. Yeah. They also prefer typically a workshop where they can bring decision makers together to discuss with you what you've learned from the case study, rather than you writing a very long PDF document that you can share around. In more written forms of reporting, so in writing, when we write different case studies here, what is important to know is that we have different ways in which we can compose these reports. Yeah, they're called compositional structures. And there are different types of structures. So a typical one would be chronological, there where we report everything that we learned in the case study from day 1 to day 100 or whenever we finished. A chronological report, everything in chronological order in which it occurred. A linear analytic compositional structure is the classical research type of way of presenting a case study, which means that we first say what is the issue or research question, what does the literature say, what were our methods and procedures, what are our findings and conclusions. This is the classical linear analytic way of scientific writing. You can distinguish this from a compositional structure, for example, that's a comparative structure, where we basically take one case study and compare it multiple times to alternative descriptions, alternative explanations, alternative theories that we would have expected, or different points of view. For completeness, you can also think of a compositional structure, for example, the suspense structure, where you're basically trying to invert the typical scientific linear analytic structure, in that you come up with a particularly surprising finding first, or insight first, and then when you build suspense, and then you move towards explaining or developing a theory around it. Why this matters is that some of these compositional structures are more or less suitable depending on what the use or purpose of the case study is. Remember that we distinguish uses such as exploratory, descriptive, or explanatory. Yeah, and you can think about that a chronological compositional structure is very useful for a descriptive case study. It can be useful for explanatory case study if your explanation has something to do with time, or emergence or development or change over time. But it's not a good format, for example, if you wanted to build theory that has nothing to do with time. Let's say if you wanted to build a systemic theory about how certain elements interact, then that's not actually a point of describing things in a chronological order. The suspense mode, where you come up with a surprising phenomenon or insight first and then build your explanation about it, this is really only tied to an explanatory case study, where you try, with the whole point of the case studies, to explain something that we beforehand didn't know how it worked. Just to give you an example of how this reporting could look like, in the case study that I've used as an illustration here, our study of the bakery departments and the positive deviance in bakeries, we have actually multiple formats. For researchers, we've written papers that appear in scientific journals in retailing. Yeah, constructive deviance as a driver performance in retails and so forth. And most of these follow a what you would call a linear analytic, and the second one a comparative compositional structure. For the industry, for the partner, we developed a glossy, shiny report, a brochure if you want. You see an image of that. And we also developed basically an online seminar, workshops that appear in presence, and there's also recordings of that, to share some of the insights that we learned. And this brings us to the end of this lecture on case study procedure. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.